Good evening, everyone, and I hope and pray this message finds you well wherever you may be and in whatever cell group you may be in. Today is the feast day of St. Francis, and I'd like to say a few words about this popular and beloved saint, but also a saint who has highly influenced the document Laudate Si, which this weekend our diocese, Bishop Allen, and Pope Francis himself are trying to encourage all Catholics to reread and to integrate its message. I think one of the great things about the cell gatherings is that we can have in-depth conversations and sharing about topics that the Church wants us to reflect on. So that's what I'd like to do with you this evening. So first of all, St. Francis is one of the most beloved and influential saints in the whole of Christendom. And I think he's the most written about person, not just in the church, but in history. More biographies exist about Francis than even Jesus himself. Our very own church here in St. Anthony's, you can see the spirituality of Francis has imbued the very walls of the church for the last 150 years. Everywhere you look, you see the legacy and the influence of the spirituality of Francis. And that is a beautiful gift to have. And I suppose it makes us even more sensitive to where we are today as a world and a church. St. Francis was born in 1181 and he died in 1226. So relatively short life, but jam-packed, as we say. A couple of years ago, I think it was in the 80s, maybe early 90s, they did like an analysis, a scientific analysis of his bones. And they discovered that he was probably about 4 feet 9 inches high, which means he was a very tiny little fellow. And also they said that he led a very austere life. Given the analysis of his bones, you could see that there was signs of malnutrition. But despite his short stature, he had a huge influence on our spiritual world that we know today and in the church. Francis was born into an upper-class society. His father was a rich merchant and his mother probably was French. His father, Pietro Bernardone, was quite severe with Francis, and he had put all his hopes and financial, economical, business hopes into Francis. But Francis took a turn for maybe, according to his father, the worst, but for us, it was for the best, when he went through a gradual conversion. He became disenchanted with the search for wealth and honor in the world. And I think one of the main turning points in his life was when he was riding a horse and he came off the horse to embrace a leper. And at that moment he said, what was sweet before now became bitter. And what was bitter now became sweet. It's the paradox of our Christian existence. And Francis lived it very, very strongly, where when you follow Christ, things of the world become secondary and spirituality becomes primordial in our lives. And Francis at that moment passed from the maiores, which is like the upper class, to the minores when he got off his horse, because only rich people back in those days would ride horses. When Francis gazed upon the cross, he saw the greatest paradox of all. He saw the worst moment in history, the point of suffering, maybe the greatest in history, and yet it was the greatest moment in history and the time of our salvation. So from then on, Francis began to see, for example, in poverty, a path to richness, and in suffering, a path to happiness. And the moment that sealed his conversion and the beginning of the Franciscans was when he was rebuilding a church in a place called San Damiano. And Jesus from the cross spoke to him and said, Francis, repair my church, for it is in ruin. And of course, Francis understood this in a very practical way, because he wanted to rebuild the church with bricks and mortar. But actually, what Jesus meant was Francis played a huge role in the renewal of the church. Francis brought a freshness and a joy and a hope and a dynamic souffle of the Holy Spirit into the announce of the gospel. in the Middle Ages. And it has repercussions right up to our day today with the spirituality of St. Francis. But there's so much to say about St. Francis, and there's so many biographies of his life. But I just want to dwell on one little point, which was his love of nature and how he saw God present in creation. But I don't know if you've ever been to SCC, but above the town there is the place called the Hermitage, and it's the place where Francis used to go to be alone to pray. And they say about 50% of his time was spent in prayer, in solitude, and in nature. And actually there's a very beautiful statue up by the Hermitage where you see Francis lying out in the grass with his hands behind his head and his legs crossed with a little piece of grass in his mouth and gazing at nature. And I think he just got so much from looking at nature and seeing God's work. And his famous Canticle of the Sun, which is one of the first and greatest works of poetry and art in Italian literature, really this shines forth. And interesting to know as well that this was written at a very difficult time in his life where maybe he was suffering the most, and yet he got so much consolation from contemplating nature and God's presence. And Francis had a huge respect for nature, for animals, for little worms, for the stones he walked upon. He called them brothers and sisters because they are created by God, and so they are connected to us. So for the last 20, 30 years, we've heard so much about climate change and the urgency that we act in view of protecting our planet. The document from Pope Francis, Laudate Si, which came out in 2015, really brought a spiritual perspective and even like a Franciscan spirituality perspective to creation, which was very beautiful and gave a depth of meaning to the challenge we have today to connect with nature and to protect our planet. It's not just saving the planet for future generations, which is important, of course, but also we are stewards, like the book of Genesis tells us, of this creation, and we will answer to God for it. So it's part of our examination of conscience and how we treat the environment and this planet we live on. If everybody in the world lived like we do in the UK, we would need 3 planets to fulfill these needs. And this weekend, Bishop Allen sent out many documents inviting us to reflect on this challenge. And not just to reflect on it, but he gave us a possibility of making 3 pledges, concrete actions. And I think that's definitely in the line of the spirituality of Pope Francis, and his desire is that the rubber hit the road, so to speak, that if every Catholic, like 1.2 billion of us, made an effort when it came to the environment, huge changes would happen in our world today. I think that's why he wants this to be like a concrete action. So maybe our cell group today could be a moment to reflect on that. What can we do personally to make an impact? As you might know, in the not too distant future, world leaders will gather in Glasgow in view of making very important decisions as well when it comes to the climate and preserving our planet. We have inherited a linear industrial system, which means when we take the Earth's material, we put it into the pipeline, so to speak, of production and make it into stuff that we want. And we use it only once and then we throw it away. Maybe a good example would be having a pipe, like a rubber hose, and it's a straight line. You take, make, use, and lose. But this method cannot go on because it will destroy our planet. So we have to think of this hose or pipe in a circular line, meaning we have to recycle and do as nature does and recycle and protect our planet. In that way, resources are used again and again, collectively and creatively, but it requires concrete decisions on everybody's part for this to happen. So I invite you tonight maybe to reflect together what we can do as a parish, as a cell group. It could be anything from grace before meals to getting to know Laudate Si encyclical better maybe, plant a window box. The list is long. I know I want to start like a a biodiversity pond. It's basically a pond in your garden, because 90% of the ponds of the UK have disappeared in the last 30, 40 years. If you remember, those of you who are maybe my age or older, there used to be loads of frogs before, but they're gone now. But it has had huge consequences. But if every garden had a little pool, they say, it would make a huge difference in the environment. Getting involved, being just gardening itself, growing your own food, maybe eating less meat, looking into other means of energy. There's so many things we can do to make a difference. And I pray that tonight's reflection for you can be rich and that we can inspire each other in this direction. God bless you all.